In this episode, I'm going to be exploring the psychological themes found in the HBO documentary Leaving Neverland. I'm going to explore how Leaving Neverland addresses grooming a family for abuse. I'm going to be exploring how to process childhood trauma as an adult. And then finally, we're going to look at the psychological concept of implicit bias and empathy. I'm Jonathan Hetterly, a therapist and contributor to Shrink Tank. Let's dive right in. Psych Cinema is where I explore the psychological themes found in the films that I watch and love. Today we're going to be looking at HBO's controversial Michael Jackson documentary, Leaving Neverland, exploring specifically the stories of Wade Robson and Jimmy Safechuck, the two accusers of Michael Jackson. Be sure to give this video a thumbs up so we know that we'll make content that you love and enjoy. So let's talk about grooming, this process where the perpetrator manipulates the entire family. Now, when you watch Leaving Neverland, or you explore the background of abusers, what we notice is that most people tend to fixate only on the sexual act, whereas grooming helps us explore all the different dimensions it requires for someone to not only abuse a child, but to be a serial offender. And both with the instance of Wade Robson and Jimmy Safechuck, Michael Jackson groomed the entire family. Now, also, if you watch the Oprah Winfrey special, she had a psychologist that is a specialist in childhood sexual abuse. He outlines 6 specific points that helps us to understand how a perpetrator goes about grooming a family and an individual for abuse. The first point that they do is they make them feel special. Michael Jackson did this by highlighting both Wade and Jimmy in terms of their dancing, their love and affection towards him. And when you pull out a kid with the global superstar, it makes them feel special and makes them feel unique. And then slowly would build their trust, become a part of their life, open into their inner circle. And that's not just with Wade or Jimmy. That requires building trust and alliance with the family, with parents, with caretakers. And we see throughout the documentary, or we hear from them, how even the parents, both of the mothers of Wade and Jimmy, viewed Michael as a part of the family, almost like another son. And then they start to feel a need. Michael starts to feel a need, whether it be professional growth and making promises about their dancing, whether it makes them feel loved and special. Who doesn't crave that as an adult or as a human, let alone a child? And so then you start to really look at some of the more atypical or problematic aspects that some people would start to notice. But as you're grooming, if you make them feel special, if you meet a need, if you build trust, finally you start to isolate the child. You start to create special sleepovers. You have the family over, but you have the family or the parents stay in a different room. You start to do things more and more apart from the family. And once you've built trust, that the parents don't see anything wrong because he's like an extension of the family. And family members don't hurt other people. And it's only at the 5th step of grooming do things start to turn sexual. And again, that's where a lot of people fixate on sexual abuse or child abuse, is the actual act of abuse. Where when we watch Leaving Neverland, you hear both Wade and James talk about all of the psychological trauma, all the emotional manipulation, all of the molding and grooming for them, so that by the time sexual activity occurred, it didn't feel completely out of place or abnormal. It just felt like a natural extension of the relationship and the love and the care that Michael had been paying to not only them, but their entire family. And then finally, the last step when it comes to grooming is that you start to maintain control. You see Michael really build, again, he rehearsed with them like what we would do if somebody was coming, how to quickly get dressed or make the situation look like nothing inappropriate was happening, how he would constantly fax or call them and continue this manipulation and control over them. And that's when also there's an element of threat or consequences of brainwashing a victim of, if anybody ever finds out about any of this, it's going to ruin my life, it's going to ruin your life, it's going to ruin your family's life. And it puts all of this fear and worry and responsibility on a child to the point that they feel like they're left with no choice but to continue to perpetuate the abuse and fall in line, even if they start to begin to recognize that something may not be appropriate or healthy going on. Well, let's shift now and talk about how we process childhood trauma as an adult, because that's been one of the key criticisms leveled at Wade and Jimmy. Specifically, how come they didn't mention this or raise concerns when they were children? How come they are only remembering certain parts later as an adult? How come they've changed their story? These are all criticisms or ways that people try to debunk the allegations against Michael Jackson. But what we know with childhood trauma is that when exposed to great fear or threat, the brain will go into defense mode to protect the child. And so in terms of even if horrible things happen to a child or something really confusing, we can't assume that a child's brain has the capability to understand and process that information, let alone articulate it in coherent language and express it to somebody else. Again, we have to remember that the abuse started long before the sexual act, making them feel special, building trust, all of that grooming to where when this happened, it may have felt very normal. They didn't have any counter data point to understand that what was happening was abuse. And that's really one of the fundamental components about processing childhood trauma as an adult. How do you know something is abusive until you have the data point to recognize that what is happening to you is wrong? And oftentimes we need life experience, maturity and growth in our brain, and different data points to start to recognize what is considered normal and abnormal, what is typical and what is crossing boundaries. The other thing is the idea of suppression, really internalizing or compartmentalizing negative, intrusive, or traumatic experiences. And we see specifically with Jimmy, even as an adult, he wasn't fully cognizant of the trauma that had happened to him or the ongoing distress and negative effects. It wasn't until 2013 when he saw Wade's interview on Good Morning America that a light bulb clicked, that he recognized that I have been sexually abused by Michael Jackson. And so even though he was aware that all of these specific acts and he had a relationship with Michael, it really wasn't until somebody else gave him that reference point and a way to understand what had happened to him was he able to sort of unlock all of that confusing information, confusing memories, experiences, and emotions, and recognize that. We cannot expect a child to have the capability to understand what is happening to them. We look to our caregivers, we look to adults to protect us and help us to understand that. And what do you do when one of the caretakers or people that you entrust for your safety is the one that is perpetrating the abuse and offense onto you? And with that, let's shift to this idea of implicit bias. And implicit bias really is how we tend to jump into stereotypes about how the world works. And when it comes to childhood abuse, our society does a really poor job of believing children or believing victims. Part of that can do with something we know as the safe world sort of mindset, where in order for us to feel safe, we have to believe that bad things don't happen or that they can be easily identified so we can protect ourselves. When you look at abuse and you look at implicit bias, there's a number of things that people have had to really reconcile with, or at least face, when it comes to how we allowed such rampant child exploitation abuse happen, not just with Michael Jackson, but more and more with documentaries like Abducted in Plain Sight or the recent R.KELLY documentary, that more and more we're seeing that celebrities and other people are getting away with horrendous acts. First is this implicit bias that we assume that childhood abusers and perpetrators are monsters and that they have to look threatening or that there has to be deep psychological traumatic backgrounds. And so the other is then you look at a celebrity, another implicit bias. They have everything going for them. Why would there be any need or desire to harm or abuse children? Specifically with Michael Jackson, the implicit bias was part of his grooming process. He poured a lot of his time and advocacy towards children. And so natural assumption for people would be there's nothing that would that would happen that would be inappropriate. Michael loves kids. He spends a lot of his time around kids and making the world a better place for them. Another implicit bias a lot of people have is also that wouldn't parents know? And wouldn't parents do something if they thought anything inappropriate was happening? But again, if we step back to abuse not just being the sexual act, but the overall grooming, you see in the documentary how Michael brought in and seduced the parents to giving him access and trust with the children. And then finally, the implicit bias that we had mentioned here in this last point was, well, if anything bad was happening, wouldn't a child bring it up? And again, this assumption that a child would or could or even understand what is going on. And so we've created a system where whenever abuse is being accused, we put the victim in the place of being defensive. They have to defend what they're saying, and we put the celebrity or the person in power and we give them the assumption of innocence, even though all abuse has to do with an abuse of power and control. And when you think of, especially with celebrities and with children, there is already a built-in displacement or imbalance of control. Why wouldn't we understand that that is ripe for any type of abuse when there is such a discrepancy with someone that has the mental emotional capabilities, let alone power and authority and the well-regarded reputation that they might have in the community? So we talked about grooming, we talked about processing trauma as an adult, and finally we talked about implicit bias. With those three psychological concepts, do you find yourself after watching Leaving Neverland to believe Wade Robson and James Safechuck? Or is some of these discrepancies or the memory of Michael Jackson not being able to defend himself something that you have a hard time believing their stories, and you still see Michael as an innocent victim in this documentary? So be sure to comment below and let me know what you thought of this documentary, as well as the three psychological concepts that we addressed in this video. To see more content, be sure to subscribe to our channel and check out shrinktank.com. There you're going to find all types of content, polls, articles, videos, and more that explore the intersection of psychology and pop culture. That's going to do it for this episode of Psych Cinema. I'm Jonathan Hetterly, and we'll see you again soon at the movies.